the office of the coroner did not begin with a desire for justice. It began with a need for money. To understand the medieval coroner, you have to forget the modern image. Forget the white coat, the sterile lab, and the scientific analysis. The first coroners were not doctors or detectives. They were royal accountants, tasked with protecting the king's financial interests in a violent and chaotic world. The story starts in England in the late 12th century. The king was Richard I, the Lionheart. Richard spent very little time in England. He was famous for his crusades and his wars in France. And wars are expensive. Richard needed a constant flow of cash to fund his ambitions. Back in England, the king's main representative in each county, or shire, was the sheriff. The sheriff was a powerful man. He collected taxes, managed royal lands, and presided over the county court. He was the king's strong arm, but that power was a problem. A sheriff could easily be tempted to skim a little off the top. He might collect a fine and report a smaller amount to the king's treasury, pocketing the difference. He could seize the property of a dead man and claim it was worth less than it was. There was very little oversight. When the king was away, the sheriffs were the real power in the land, and many used that power for their own gain. The crown was losing money. It was losing control, so in 1194 a new set of rules was issued. These rules created a new office. The official title was Custos Placetorum Coronae, which is Latin for Keeper of the Pleas of the Crown. Pleas of the Crown were the criminal cases and legal matters that directly affected the king. This included serious crimes like murder, but it also included anything that could bring money or property to the crown. The man who held this new office became known as the coroner. 4 coroners were to be elected in every county. They were not appointed by the sheriff. They were chosen by the men of the county court. This was important. It made them independent of the sheriff. Their job was to act as a check on his power. They were the king's eyes and ears. When something happened in the county that might be of financial interest to the king, the coroner was to be called. He would go to the scene, take notes, and keep a record. His record would be separate from the sheriff's. Later, when the royal judges, called justices in eyre, traveled through the county, they would have 2 sets of books to compare. They had the sheriff's account of events, and they had the coroner's account. If a sheriff reported that a dead man had no valuable goods, but the coroner's roll listed a horse, a sword, and 10 shillings, the sheriff would have some difficult questions to answer. The coroner's main purpose was to ensure that nothing belonging to the king went missing. These first coroners were meant to be local knights. They had to be landowners of some substance. This was for 2 reasons. First, a man with his own land and income was thought to be less susceptible to bribes. He wouldn't be desperate for a small payoff from a corrupt sheriff. Second, if a coroner did mess up or prove to be corrupt himself, he had property that the king could seize as punishment. He had something to lose. So, he was expected to be a man of good standing, respected in his community, and loyal to the king. His role was not to solve crimes in the way we think of it today. He wasn't there to find the murderer for the sake of the victim's family. He was there because a murder created a financial opportunity for the king. The murderer's lands and goods could be forfeited to the crown. The village where the body was found might be fined if they failed to raise a hue and cry and catch the killer. The whole process was wrapped up in money. The coroner's job was to document the circumstances of a death or a crime so that the king could get his rightful share. Role, born from a crusading king's need for cash and a deep-seated distrust of, lowers a premium package of high quality. While the investigation of sudden or suspicious death became the coroner's most famous duty, it was far from his only one. His official title, Keeper of the Pleas of the Crown, covered a wide range of incidents. Anything that could potentially add to the king's treasury fell under his watch. The coroner was a sort of royal scavenger, making sure no valuable scrap was lost to the crown. One of his most important non-death related duties was dealing with treasure trove. In medieval law, treasure trove was not just any found valuables. It had a specific definition. It had to be gold or silver, in the form of coin, plate, or bullion. It had to have been hidden in the past, with the intention of later recovery. And the original owner had to be dead and unknown. If someone digging in a field found a pot of old Roman coins, that was treasure trove. It belonged to the king by right. If such a discovery was made, the coroner had to be called. He would convene a jury of local men, just as he would for a dead body. They would be asked to confirm what was found, where it was found, and who found it. The coroner would take possession of the treasure on behalf of the crown. The finder was supposed to receive a reward, but the treasure itself was the king's. The coroner's role was to make sure the finder didn't just quietly pocket the coins, and that the sheriff didn't take it for himself. His written record ensured the treasure made it to the royal treasury. The coroner also had jurisdiction over wrecks of the sea. When a ship was wrecked on the coast, its cargo was a tempting prize for anyone who lived nearby. But according to royal law, if no human or animal survived the wreck, the ship and its contents belonged to the king. The coroner of the coastal county would be called to the scene. He would view the wreck, record the contents of the cargo, and secure it for the crown. This was another way to prevent the sheriff or local lords from claiming valuable goods for themselves. The coroner's role would be the official record of what washed ashore, from barrels of wine to bolts of cloth. Another strange but significant duty involves something called a deond. The word comes from the Latin deodandum, meaning to be given to God. A deodand was any object, animate or inanimate, that had caused a person's death. If a man was kicked by a horse and died, the horse was the deodand. If a man fell from a cart and was crushed by its wheel, the cart and wheel were the deodand. If he fell out of a boat and drowned, the boat was the deodand. The object was considered responsible for the death. It was declared forfeit. The coroner would hold an inquest, and his jury would name the object that caused the death and determine its value. That object, or its value in money, was then forfeited to the crown. The original idea was that the object was tainted by the death, and its value would be used for a pious purpose, like giving alms to the poor to pray for the soul of the deceased. In practice, it became another source of royal income. The coroner's job was to identify the deodand and assess its value, ensuring the king got his due from the fatal cart, horse, or boat. Perhaps one of the most dramatic roles of the coroner was in cases of abjuration of the realm. If a criminal fleeing from the law could reach a church, he could claim sanctuary. He was safe from arrest as long as he stayed inside the consecrated ground, but he couldn't stay there forever. After a period, usually up to 40 days, he had to make a choice. He could surrender and face trial, or he could confess his crime to the coroner and agree to abjure the realm. This meant he would swear an oath to leave England forever. The coroner would go to the church, often standing at the church door, and take the man's confession. The confession was written down in the coroner's roll. The coroner would then assign the man a port from which he had to leave the country. The man would be stripped to his undergarments, and he would have to walk to that port carrying a wooden cross. He could not stray from the king's highway. If he did, he could be killed on sight. It was a form of exile. The coroner's role here was crucial. He was the official witness to the confession and the oath. His record proved the man was an outlaw and ensured that his lands and goods were forfeited to the king. In all these duties, the pattern is the same. The coroner was there to document, to witness, and to secure the financial rights of the crown. The heart of the medieval coroner's job, and the part that has survived to this day, was the inquest into a suspicious death. When a body was found under circumstances that were not obviously natural, the coroner had to be summoned. This process was formal and followed a strict set of procedures. It was not a quest for forensic truth, but a fact-finding mission for the king's court. The process began with the discovery of the body. The person who found the body, known as the first finder, had a legal duty to raise the alarm. He would alert the local village officials, like the reeve or constable. They, in turn, were required to send for the coroner of the county. The body was not to be moved or buried until the coroner had conducted his view. Moving the body was a serious offense, and the entire village could be fined for it. This was to ensure the coroner saw the scene exactly as it was when the body was discovered. Getting the coroner to the scene could take time. A county was a large area, and there were only 4 coroners to cover it. The coroner might live a day or two's ride away. In the meantime, the body would be guarded where it lay. When the coroner finally arrived, his first official act was the view of the body. He would look at the deceased, taking note of its position and any obvious injuries. This was a visual inspection, not a medical examination. The coroner was a layman, a knight, or a landowner, not a physician. He was looking for clear signs of violence, stab wounds, a crushed skull, marks of strangulation. His next step was to empanel a jury. This was not a trial jury that would decide guilt or innocence. It was an investigative jury meant to provide the coroner with local knowledge. The jury was typically made up of men from the village where the body was found and from several neighboring villages. This was to get a wider pool of information and to prevent a single village from covering up a crime to protect one of its own. The coroner, with his jury, would then begin the inquest. He would ask a series of standard questions. Who was this person? Where were they found? How, in the jury's opinion, did they die? If they were killed, what weapon was used? He would question witnesses. The most important witness was the first finder. The first finder was always under suspicion until he could prove his innocence. He had to show where he was and what he was doing before he found the body and demonstrate that he had raised the alarm properly. The jury would examine the body with the coroner. Their collective job was to describe any wounds in detail. The coroner's records, known as the coroner's rolls, are full of specific descriptions: a wound to the head 3 inches long and to the depth of the brain, or a wound in the belly made with a certain knife of which he died. If a person was suspected, the jury would name them. They would be asked if the suspect had fled. Fleeing was seen as a strong admission of guilt. If the suspect had fled, the jury would then have to list all the goods and chattels the suspect owned, down to the last pot and pan, because these would be immediately forfeited to the crown. Everything was meticulously recorded by a clerk on a long strip of parchment, the coroner's roll. This was the official record of the inquest. It contained the date, the place, the name of the deceased, the names of the jurors, their verdict on the cause of death, the name of any suspect, and a list of the suspect's property. These rolls were the coroner's main product. They were carefully preserved and brought before the king's traveling judges when they next visited the county. The judges would use the coroner's roll to begin legal proceedings. If a suspect was named, the sheriff would be ordered to arrest them. If the village was found to be at fault for not pursuing a killer, for example, the judges would impose a fine. The roll was the primary evidence. The entire system was designed to be a preliminary investigation. The coroner did not determine guilt. He simply gathered the initial facts, identified a suspect, if possible, and recorded everything so that the royal justice system could take over and, most importantly, so the king could collect the resulting fines and forfeitures. Who were the men who held this office? The medieval coroner was not a professional in the modern sense. He was not a career civil servant, nor was he trained in medicine or law. He was, in theory, a knight. The original ordinance of 1194 specified that coroners should be chosen from the most loyal and discreet knights of the shire. In practice, the role was often filled by men from the gentry class, substantial landowners who might not hold the title of knight, but who possessed wealth and status. The key qualification was property. A coroner had to be a man of means. This was not because the job required financial expertise, but because the crown wanted officials who were financially secure. A man with his own income was considered less likely to be tempted by a bribe from a sheriff or a criminal. Furthermore, if a coroner was found to be negligent or corrupt, his lands and property could be confiscated by the king as a penalty. His wealth acted as a kind of security deposit for his good behavior. A landless man had nothing to lose and could not be held to account in the same way. Coroners were elected, not appointed. They were chosen in the county court by the suitors of the court, which meant the freeholders of the county. This local election gave the coroner a degree of independence. He did not owe his position to the king directly, nor to the sheriff he was meant to watch over. He was a local man chosen by his peers to serve the crown. This created a strange balance. He was a royal official, but his power base was local. This made him a bridge between the central authority of the king and the local communities of the shire. The job itself was a heavy burden. For all its importance, the office of coroner was unpaid. There was no salary. A coroner might be able to charge small fees for making copies of his records, but this was not enough to live on. The work was demanding. He could be called out at any time, in any weather, to travel to a remote corner of the county. The journey could be long and dangerous. He had to deal with grieving families, hostile villagers, and decomposing bodies. It was often a gruesome and thankless task. Given that it was unpaid and unpleasant, why would anyone want the job? For some, it was a matter of duty and social standing. Holding the office of coroner was a mark of prestige. It showed that you were one of the most important and trusted men in your county. It gave a man influence and a voice in local affairs. It also brought him into direct contact with the king's powerful traveling justices, which could be a useful connection. For others, there were likely opportunities for informal gain. While the office was unpaid, it offered power. A coroner could use his position to settle old scores or to do favors for his friends. He had the power to inconvenience people, to force them to serve on juries, and to pry into their affairs. A dishonest coroner could be a real threat. He might extort money from a village by threatening to find them negligent. He could be bribed to record a death as an accident rather than a homicide. The records show that coroners were sometimes fined or removed from office for corruption or for neglecting their duties. The coroner was therefore a complex figure. He was supposed to be a pillar of the community, a loyal knight serving his king. But he was also a man subject to the same temptations and pressures as anyone else. He was not a specialist. He was a land manager, a farmer, perhaps a soldier who took on this public duty. His skills were not in forensic science, but in administration and managing a jury, of his neighbors and in writing a clear and accurate report for a distant king. He was a product of his time, a local notable tasked with a royal duty, navigating a world where justice and profit were often one and the same. The coroner of the 12th and 13th centuries was a powerful and busy man. His responsibilities were vast, touching on death, treasure, shipwrecks, and criminals. He was a cornerstone of royal administration in the shires, but over the next few centuries, his power began to wane. The role of the coroner did not vanish, but it was slowly stripped of its many duties, becoming more and more specialized until only the core function of death investigation remained. The biggest challenge to the coroner's authority came from a new type of local official, the Justice of the Peace, or JP. The office of JP began to develop in the 14th century. JPs were also local landowners and men of good standing, just like the coroners. But their mandate was much broader. They were, tasked with keeping the peace, which involved everything from dealing with minor riots and disputes to arresting suspected felons. They were given judicial powers, allowing them to hear and judge many criminal cases themselves, rather than just recording facts for the king's traveling judges. As the power and number of JPs grew, they began to take over tasks that had once belonged to the coroner. For example, a JP could now conduct the initial examination of a suspected felon and take statements. The dramatic process of a criminal confessing to a coroner before abjuring the realm became less common. The JPs offered a more direct and efficient way of dealing with local crime. They were on the ground, numerous, and had the power to act immediately. The coroner, with his more limited and reactive role, began to seem less relevant in the day-to-day administration of justice. The financial duties of the coroner also started to fade. The royal government became more centralized and bureaucratic. The king's treasury, the exchequer, developed more sophisticated methods for collecting revenue. Instead of relying on a coroner to secure the value of a shipwreck or a deodan, the crown could use other agents, like escheators, who specialized in managing forfeited property. The concept of the deodan itself, the idea of an object being forfeit for causing a death, gradually fell out of favor and was eventually abolished in the 19th century. And treasure trove remained a concern, but it was a rare event, not a daily duty. The coroner's role as a financial watchdog for the king became less and less important. By the Tudor period, the coroner was already a much diminished figure. He was no longer the king's primary check on the sheriff. His broad authority over all pleas of the crown had been sliced away, with most of it passing to the justices of the peace. What was left was the one duty that nobody else wanted: the inquest into sudden, violent, or unnatural death. This became the coroner's specialty. This specialization, however, ensured the office's survival. While JPs handled living criminals, the coroner handled the dead. The need for an independent official to investigate suspicious deaths did not go away. If anything, it became more entrenched in the English legal system. The idea that the state had a duty to inquire when one of its subjects died in unclear circumstances was a powerful one. The coroner's inquest remained the primary mechanism for this, so the coroner's role transformed. He began as a royal revenue agent, a man primarily concerned with the king's profit. He was a jack of all trades for royal interests, from murders to sunken ships. Over centuries, his other responsibilities were peeled away by more specialized officials. He was left with the dead. The modern coroner is the direct descendant of this long process of narrowing and specialization. The core function of convening a jury to determine the facts of a death has survived for over 800 years. It is a legacy of a time when justice was a business and the coroner was the king's local auditor, ensuring that even in death, the crown received its due.